This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Montblanc Oyster Grey. I'll be testing it in a variety of pins and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib, and I'll be showing it writing samples on a variety of paper qualities. Now my writing sample that I'm going to be showing is in an old Hobonichi Weeks. It's the Mega, so I've got a lot of the Tomoe River note paper to use. I finished up my two Hobonichi Techos. They were old Techos that I just used for writing samples. Now the paper is a little bit, on the Weeks, it's a little bit off-white, but it's fall now and I'm going to be testing a lot of fall type colors and muted colors anyway, and I find that they look really good on this off-white paper. And I'm going to begin with a Pilot Extra Fine. This is a Pilot 78G Plus. It's got a stainless steel extra fine nib. Alright, and I could tell when I was doing the other writing samples or writing samples on other papers that this ink reminds me a lot of Diamine Earl Grey. It's just very watery, not very saturated. And so with this extra fine, it feels scratchy. It just, the ink doesn't provide much cushion for that really fine nib. Next, I have a Sailor Pro Gear Slim. And again, it just feels really scratchy. Sailor nibs are known for their feedback, and the downstrokes weren't that bad. You can see that they're a little darker, but the side strokes are just really unpleasant. Yeah, and this feels scratchy. And I will say, I haven't tried this ink in a Sailor medium, but when I tried Diamine Earl Grey in my Sailor with a medium nib, it was very unpleasant. So this is an ink I probably would not use in a Sailor or a Platinum medium or smaller nib. I've never used a broad nib in either of those two brands, but I know the medium and fine would not be pleasant. All right, next I have a TWSBI Mini. This has a very smooth nib, and this feels much better than the first two. Now, this is a fine nib. It's usually very smooth. With most inks, it is very smooth, but I'm feeling a little bit of feedback. It's not unpleasant though, especially after using the first two pens. This does feel better. But I would say there's a notable amount of feedback. Let me see. I'm going to say this feels dry with some feedback. Okay, but it is looking better. Next, I've got my Pilot Stargazer with a medium nib. This is also a very glassy, smooth nib, but it's also much wetter than the TWSBI. Now this is very nice. Very smooth. You don't feel any of that dryness that I felt with the first 3 nibs. This is nice. And since this ink feels a lot like Diamine Earl Grey, I use Diamine Earl Grey a lot in my Pilot Custom 74 with a fine nib, and I love it. In fact, I have Diamine Earl Grey in it right now. So, since Pilot nibs are smoother than Sailor or Platinum, and they've got the wetness, this ink is a good match for them. Now, the Pilot Cursive Medium stainless steel nib, this is a different story, or it has been on the other papers that I've tried it on so far. This is a dry nib, and this ink does not work well with dry nibs. It doesn't look good. Some Metropolitan. You can see it's very dry compared to the other nibs. This is dry to the point of being unpleasant. Don't like that. Okay, and the last pen I have is my Jinhao X750 with a 1.5 stub nib. Okay, and that's a pretty wet nib, and that ink just almost wipes away. It's very pale when it's in a thin layer. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry while we take a look at the other 2 papers. Now, this is Tomoe River. This is my top-notch fountain pen paper. A mid-tier paper would be my Rhodia. And again, really the only pen I liked on this paper was the Pilot Stargazer, because it's got a wet, glassy, smooth nib. The others, if it's a fine nib, it's going to be scratchy. If it's a dry nib, you're going to feel that dryness. Just a wet, smooth nib is what you want to go for. Now, you can probably get by with a smooth nib, like the TWSBI Mini. It was nice, but there was some feedback. You can get by with it, but ideally, you want both a wet and a smooth nib. Okay, my 20-pound copy paper was a surprise. The extra fine wasn't scratchy. It was tolerable for little short bits of writing. Now, the Sailor Pro Gear Slim was still dry, and it was unpleasant. The TWSBI Mini felt dry, but it was okay. It was tolerable. Surprisingly, the Pilot Stargazer, I thought it would feather and be unpleasant. With all the ink that it puts down, it didn't feather, and it felt nice. I was surprised. And the Pilot Metropolitan felt dry, but it was okay. It wasn't unbearable. And when I flipped it over, it did incredibly well. I mean, the 1.5 stub is the only one that really wanted to bleed through. I guess the medium maybe in spots wanted to bleed through, but wow, this performs really well on poor quality paper. And let me see, I've got my little writing sample that I do in my Leuchtturm. It's just a nice flat gray ink. Yeah, it looks nice. And let's see. Oh, sorry about that. Back to the Tomoe River paper. Really, again, on my 2 good papers, the only nib that I really liked was the Pilot. And really, on good paper, I would suggest a nice wet and really smooth nib. And on poor quality paper, you've got even more flexibility, surprisingly. All right. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.